6 months ago, I was Joaquin Restrepo, a stonemason carving headstones in Denver when the power died and the dead started walking. I survived the first 6 months of the zombie outbreak by turning my workshop into a fortress, leading survivors through underground tunnels and building humanity's last stronghold from solid stone. This is how I stayed alive when civilization crumbled around me. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Restrepo, and I spent 22 years of my life carving names into stone, creating memorials for the dead. I never imagined that one day I would be living among them, fighting for my life against them, and using every skill I had learned to keep myself and others alive. This story begins on September 12, 2024, when I was working on what I thought would be just another headstone in my workshop in Denver, Colorado. I remember that morning clearly because it was the last normal day I would ever experience. The sun was streaming through the dusty windows of my workshop, casting long shadows across the granite slab I was carving. It was a memorial for Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before coming home and living another 40 years before cancer took him. His daughter had commissioned me to carve his military service record along with a simple message about a life well lived. The work was meditative, the way it always was. Each strike of the chisel against the stone required precision, patience, and respect for the material. Granite does not forgive mistakes, and neither do the families who trust you with their most precious memories. I had been working since dawn, my hands moving in the familiar rhythm that my grandfather had taught me when I was 12 years old. Fresh from Colombia and eager to learn a trade that would give me a place in this new country, my workshop sat in the Highlands neighborhood, a few miles north of downtown Denver. It was a converted garage that I had reinforced over the years with thick stone walls. Not because I was paranoid, but because working with heavy slabs of granite and marble required a foundation that could handle the weight and vibration of the tools. The walls were 2 feet thick in some places, built from Colorado sandstone that I had quarried myself from a site west of the city. Those walls had taken me 3 summers to complete, but they were solid, permanent, the kind of construction that would last for generations. I should mention that just 2 weeks before that September morning, I had finished a major project that would prove more important than I could have imagined. Father Martinez at St. Augustine's Church had hired me to reinforce the old stone walls of the cathedral. The building was over 100 years old, and time had not been kind to the mortar between the stones. What started as a simple repair job had turned into a complete structural reinforcement project. The priest had been very specific about his requirements. He wanted those walls strong enough to last centuries, he said, strong enough to withstand anything that might come. I thought he was just being dramatic, the way religious people sometimes are about permanence and legacy. I spent 6 months working on that church, replacing crumbling mortar with modern compounds, adding steel reinforcement rods, and essentially turning a beautiful old building into a fortress disguised as a house of worship. The work required me to study the original construction techniques, to understand how the stonemasons of the 1800s had approached their craft. I discovered that the church had been built on top of older foundations, remnants of mining operations that had been abandoned when the silver boom ended. The basement levels went deeper than most people realized, connecting to a network of tunnels that had once been used to transport ore from the mountains to the processing facilities in the city. During the renovation, I found old blueprints tucked away in the church archives, hand-drawn maps of the underground passages that connected St. Augustine's to other buildings in the historic district. Father Martinez seemed particularly interested in these discoveries, asking me to document everything I found and to ensure that the entrances to the lower levels were properly sealed and reinforced. At the time, I thought it was just historical curiosity, but I kept copies of those maps in my workshop files. The tools I used for my work were a mixture of modern equipment and traditional hand tools that had been passed down through 3 generations of my family. My grandfather, Roberto Restrepo, had been a stone carver in Medellin before the violence of the 80s forced him to bring his family north. He had taught my father, and my father had taught me, though I was the first to make it my primary profession rather than just a side skill. Roberto's tools were works of art in themselves. His chisels were forged from high-carbon steel, shaped and tempered by hand, with handles carved from Colombian hardwood that had been seasoned for decades. Each tool was designed for specific tasks, from the broad-faced chisels used for removing large amounts of material to the fine-pointed tools used for detailed lettering and decorative work. He had always told me that a craftsman's tools were his lifeline, that in difficult times, a man who could work with his hands would never go hungry. I kept Roberto's tools in a special case in my workshop, wrapped in oiled leather to protect them from moisture and corrosion. They were not just family heirlooms, but functional instruments that I used regularly, especially for the most delicate work. Modern pneumatic tools could remove stone quickly, but for precision work, for the kind of carving that required absolute control, nothing could replace the feel of a properly balanced hand tool. On that September morning, I was using one of Roberto's finest chisels to carve the final letters of Staff Sergeant Torres's name when the lights went out. At first, I thought it was just a power fluctuation, the kind of brief interruption that happens during storms or when the grid is overloaded. But the lights did not come back on, and after a few minutes, I realized that the electrical hum that usually filled the workshop had gone completely silent. I set down my tools and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood to see if other buildings were affected. The street lights were dark, and I could see neighbors coming out of their houses, looking around with the same confused expression that I probably had. Mrs. Chun from next door was standing on her porch, shading her eyes as she looked up and down the street. She caught sight of me and waved, calling out to ask if my power was working. The silence was unusual for a Tuesday morning. Normally, the neighborhood would be filled with the sounds of traffic, lawnmowers, construction equipment, and the general buzz of a city going about its business. But without electricity, without the constant background noise of modern life, everything seemed muted and strange. I could hear individual conversations from blocks away, the sound of car engines becoming more noticeable as people started their vehicles to check if the problem was limited to the power grid. I walked outside to talk with Mrs. Chun and some of the other neighbors who had gathered in the street. Tom Hendricks, who worked as an electrician for the city, was already trying to use his truck's radio to contact his dispatcher. He was getting nothing but static, which was unusual because the city's emergency communication system was supposed to be hardened against power outages. Mrs. Chun suggested that we turn on battery-powered radios to find out what was happening. I went back to my workshop and retrieved the old transistor radio that I kept for listening to news while I worked. It was another piece of equipment that Roberto had insisted every household should have, a simple device that could receive broadcasts, even when more sophisticated electronics failed. The radio crackled to life, and we gathered around it in Tom's driveway, straining to hear the emergency broadcast that was cutting in and out through waves of static. The voice was professional but tense, clearly reading from a prepared script about a massive solar event that had disrupted power grids across North America. The announcer said that utilities were working to restore service, but that the extent of the damage was still being assessed. What struck me as odd was that the broadcast kept cutting off mid-sentence, as if the station itself was having technical difficulties. Between the official announcements, we could hear fragments of other transmissions, voices that sounded more urgent, more panicked than the calm tone of the emergency broadcast system. Someone was talking about disturbances in major cities, about military units being deployed, about hospitals being overwhelmed. but the signal was too weak and fragmented to make out the details. Tom seemed particularly concerned about the communication blackout. He explained that the city's emergency services relied on a network of redundant systems that should have been able to function even during a major power outage. The fact that he could not reach his dispatcher suggested that the problem was more serious than a simple grid failure. He decided to drive to the nearest fire station to find out what was happening and to report that our neighborhood was without power. While Tom was gone, I took the opportunity to take inventory of my situation. My workshop was well stocked with tools and materials, but I had never thought much about emergency preparedness beyond the basic supplies that any homeowner might keep. I had a few days' worth of food, some bottled water, and a generator that I used occasionally for outdoor projects. The generator had enough fuel to run for maybe 8 hours, which I had always assumed would be sufficient for any temporary outage. The workshop itself was more defensible than a typical residential building, thanks to the thick stone walls and the heavy steel door that I had installed to protect my equipment from theft. The windows were small and high, originally designed to let in light for detailed work while minimizing distractions from the street. Now I realized that these features, which I had chosen for practical reasons, might serve other purposes if the situation continued to deteriorate. I began to organize my tools and materials, not because I expected to need them for defense, but because Roberto had taught me that in uncertain times, a craftsman should know exactly what resources he has available. I cataloged my hand tools, my pneumatic equipment, the various abrasives and cutting compounds that I used for different types of stone. I also made note of the raw materials I had in stock, including several slabs of granite and sandstone that were waiting to be carved into memorial pieces. As I worked, I kept thinking about the mining maps I had found at St. Augustine's Church. The tunnels they depicted were supposedly sealed, but I knew from my work on the foundation that some of the passages were still accessible. The maps showed connections between the church and several other buildings in the historic district, including the old courthouse and the original city hall. If the situation on the surface became dangerous, those tunnels might provide a way to move unseen through the city. I was still organizing my workshop when Tom returned from the fire station, and the expression on his face told me that the news was not good. He had found the station empty except for one firefighter who was monitoring the radio, trying to maintain contact with other emergency services. According to what he had learned, the solar event was more severe than the initial reports had indicated. Power grids across the entire continent were down, and there was no clear timeline for restoration. More disturbing were the reports coming in from other cities. The firefighter had been in contact with colleagues in Chicago, Atlanta, and Phoenix, and they were all reporting unusual incidents that seemed to be connected to the power outage. There were accounts of violent attacks, of people behaving in ways that did not make sense, of hospitals being overwhelmed with patients who had suffered what appeared to be severe neurological damage. The pattern was consistent across multiple cities. Within hours of the power failure, emergency services had begun receiving calls about individuals who were attacking others in a frenzied, animalistic manner. The victims of these attacks were being rushed to hospitals with severe bite wounds and traumatic injuries, but many were dying despite medical intervention. Even more troubling, some of the victims were reportedly recovering from their injuries only to exhibit the same violent behavior as their attackers. Tom's contact at the fire station had been instructed to maintain normal operations as much as possible, but he was clearly frightened by what he was hearing. The radio chatter from other cities was becoming increasingly frantic, with reports of entire hospital wards being evacuated and military units being deployed to maintain order. The official line was still that these were isolated incidents related to the stress and confusion caused by the power outage, but the pattern was too widespread to be coincidental. As we talked, I noticed that Mrs. Chun had not come out of her house for several hours. This was unusual because she was normally very social, always the first to check on neighbors during any kind of emergency. Her house was dark, like all the others on the street, but there was something about the silence from her property that made me uneasy. I decided to walk over and check on her, partly out of neighborly concern and partly because I wanted to maintain some sense of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation. I knocked on her front door and called her name, but there was no response. The door was unlocked, which was also unusual because Mrs. Chin was security conscious and always kept her home locked, even during the day. I pushed the door open and called again, stepping into the living room where I could see the outline of furniture in the dim light filtering through the curtains. The house smelled wrong, like copper and something else that I could not identify. I found Mrs. Chun in her kitchen, sitting at the table with her head down as if she had fallen asleep. But when I touched her shoulder to wake her, she looked up at me with eyes that were completely white, rolled back in her head, and her mouth was stained with what looked like blood. She moved toward me with a jerky, unnatural gait, making sounds that were not quite human. I backed away, not understanding what I was seeing, but knowing instinctively that something was very wrong. Mrs. Chun had always been a small, frail woman, but she was moving with a strength and aggression that seemed impossible for someone her age. She grabbed at me with hands that were cold and stiff, and I could see that her fingernails were torn and bloody. I managed to get out of the house and back to the street, where Tom was waiting with a concerned expression. When I told him what I had seen, he initially thought that Mrs. Chun might have suffered some kind of medical emergency, perhaps a stroke or seizure that had left her confused and disoriented. But as we talked, we both realized that her behavior matched the reports we had been hearing on the radio about violent attacks in other cities. The reality of our situation began to sink in as we stood there in the growing darkness of the first evening without power. This was not just an electrical grid failure, and the incidents being reported were not isolated cases of people snapping under stress. Something had happened during the blackout, something that was turning ordinary people into violent, mindless attackers. The pattern was spreading, and it was only a matter of time before it reached our neighborhood. I told Tom that I was going to secure my workshop and prepare for whatever might be coming. He decided to gather his family and some supplies and head to his brother's house in the mountains, hoping to get away from the city before the situation got worse. We shook hands and wished each other luck, both knowing that we might not see each other again. As I walked back to my workshop, I could hear sirens in the distance, the sound echoing off the buildings in a way that made it impossible to determine the direction. The sirens seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, as if the entire city was experiencing emergencies simultaneously. There were also other sounds that I had not noticed before. Breaking glass, shouting voices, and what might have been gunfire, though it was hard to be certain from so far away. I spent the rest of that first night reinforcing my workshop using techniques I had learned from years of construction work. I moved the heaviest stone slabs to barricade the windows and the back door, leaving only the front entrance accessible. I positioned my tools where I could reach them quickly, and I tested my generator to make sure it would provide power for my electric tools if needed. The work was familiar and calming, a way to channel my anxiety into productive activity. As I worked, I thought about Roberto's stories of the violence in Colombia, how he had learned to prepare for situations where normal society broke down and people had to rely on their own skills and resources to survive. He had always insisted that a man who could work with his hands, who understood how to build and repair and create, would have advantages that others lacked when civilization failed. I also thought about the cemetery where I had been working regularly, carving headstones for families who wanted to honor their dead with permanent memorials. The cemetery was only a few blocks away, and I realized that if the situation continued to deteriorate, It might provide a temporary refuge. Grounds were surrounded by a wrought iron fence, and the landscape was dotted with stone monuments that could provide cover. More importantly, most people would be reluctant to take shelter in a cemetery, which might make it safer than more obvious locations. By dawn on the second day, I had transformed my workshop into a defensible position. The stone walls that I had built for practical reasons now served as fortifications, and the heavy tools of my trade had become potential weapons. I had also moved my most valuable possessions, including Roberto's tools and the mining maps from St. Augustine's Church, to a secure location where they would be protected even if the main workshop was compromised. The morning brought new sounds. From the city center, more sirens, the rumble of heavy vehicles, and what sounded like explosions or demolition work. The emergency radio broadcasts had become more frequent but less informative, consisting mainly of instructions for people to stay indoors and await further information. Between the official announcements, however, the fragments of other transmissions were becoming clearer and more disturbing. I heard military personnel coordinating the evacuation of civilian areas, medical personnel describing patients with symptoms that did not match any known disease, and emergency responders requesting additional resources for situations that they clearly did not understand. The picture that emerged from these scattered reports was of a city, and possibly an entire region, that was descending into chaos as some kind of contagion spread through the population. On the afternoon of the second day, I saw my first infected person other than Mrs. Chen. A man in a business suit was walking down the middle of the street, moving with the same jerky, unnatural gait that I had observed in my neighbor. His clothes were torn and bloody, and he was making guttural noises that barely sounded human. He seemed to be following some kind of scent or sound that I could not detect, turning his head from side to side as if searching for something. I watched him from my workshop window, careful to remain out of sight. The man's behavior was disturbing, not just because of the obvious violence he had suffered, but because of the way he moved with purpose despite his apparent injuries. He was not wandering aimlessly like someone who was delirious or confused. He was hunting. The man eventually moved on, disappearing around a corner toward the main commercial district. But his presence in my neighborhood meant that whatever was happening in the city center was spreading outward, reaching areas that had seemed safe just hours before. I realized that my workshop, no matter how well fortified, was not going to be sufficient protection if the situation continued to deteriorate. I spent the rest of the second day refining my defenses and planning potential escape routes. The mining maps that I had found at St. Augustine's Church showed several entrances to the underground tunnel system, including one that was supposedly located in the basement of a building only 3 blocks from my workshop. If I could reach that entrance, I might be able to move through the city without being detected by whatever was stalking the streets above. The third day brought the confirmation that my worst fears were justified. I was awakened before dawn by the sound of breaking glass and screaming from somewhere nearby. Looking out my window, I could see smoke rising from several buildings in the direction of the commercial district. The emergency radio broadcasts had become increasingly infrequent, and when they did occur, they consisted mainly of automated messages instructing people to remain calm and await assistance. But the most disturbing development was the realization that Mrs. Chun's house was no longer empty. Through my window, I could see movement in her kitchen, shadows passing back and forth as if someone was searching through her belongings. The figure was too tall to be Mrs. Chun, and it moved with the same unnatural gait that I had observed in the infected man the day before. As I watched, the figure appeared at Mrs. Chun's front door, standing motionless for several minutes as if listening for something. Then it began to move systematically from house to house, checking doors and windows with a persistence that suggested intelligence despite its obviously abnormal behavior. It was not just wandering randomly, but conducting what appeared to be a deliberate search. The infected person reached Tom's house and spent several minutes examining the doors and windows before moving on. When it reached the house directly across from my workshop, it stopped and turned to face my building. For a moment, I thought it might have seen me, but then I realized that it was probably responding to some other stimulus, perhaps the smell of the oil I used to maintain my tools or the sound of my generator. The infected person crossed the street and approached my workshop door. I could hear it testing the handle, pushing against the reinforced steel, and making the same guttural noises that seemed to be a common characteristic of the condition. The door held, and after several minutes, the figure moved around to the side of the building where I had barricaded the windows with stone slabs. I watched from my concealed position as the infected person pressed against the stone barriers, pushing with a strength that seemed far beyond what a normal human should possess. The stones shifted slightly but held their position, and after what felt like an eternity, the figure moved away from my workshop and continued down the street. The encounter left me with no doubt that my situation was about to become much more dangerous. The infected people were not just mindless attackers, but persistent hunters who were systematically searching for survivors. My workshop might be defensible against one or two of them, but if they began to arrive in larger numbers, or if they found a way to coordinate their efforts, my stone walls would not be sufficient protection. I made the decision to begin preparing for evacuation to St. Augustine's Church. The building was larger and more defensible than my workshop, and I knew that the structural reinforcements I had installed would make it nearly impregnable. More importantly, the church's connection to the underground tunnel system would provide escape routes if the surface became completely unsafe. I gathered Roberto's tools and the most essential supplies, packing them in a way that would allow me to move quickly if necessary. I also prepared several backup plans, including alternative routes to the church and contingency supplies that I could access if my primary escape route was compromised. The work was methodical and calming, a way to maintain focus in an increasingly chaotic situation. As the third day ended, I could see fires burning in multiple locations throughout the city. The sounds of sirens had stopped, replaced by more disturbing noises, screaming, the crash of breaking glass, and what sounded like large numbers of people moving through the streets. The emergency broadcasts had ceased entirely, leaving only static and the occasional fragment of unofficial transmission from someone trying to coordinate with other survivors. I spent that night in my workshop, listening to the sounds of the city dying around me. The neighborhood that had been quiet and peaceful just 3 days before was now filled with the sounds of violence and chaos. I could hear infected people moving through the streets, their guttural calls echoing off the buildings in a way that made it impossible to determine how many of them were out there. But I was not just waiting passively for the situation to resolve itself. I was preparing for the next phase of survival, gathering the tools and knowledge that would be necessary to navigate a world where the normal rules of society no longer applied. Roberto had taught me that a craftsman's greatest advantage was his ability to adapt, to find new uses for familiar tools, to create solutions from whatever materials were available. As I sat in the darkness of my workshop, surrounded by the tools and traditions of 3 generations of stone carvers, I realized that my grandfather's stories about surviving in a world of violence and chaos were about to become directly relevant to my own life. The skills I had learned for creating memorials to the dead would now be used to keep myself and others alive in a world where the dead had returned to hunt the living. The morning of the 4th day brought a decision that would define the next phase of my survival. I had spent the night listening to the infected moving through the neighborhood, their guttural calls becoming more frequent and organized. It was clear that remaining in my workshop was no longer a viable long-term strategy. The stone walls that had protected me for 3 days were solid, but they were also a prison that would eventually become a tomb if I did not act. I made my first supply run at dawn, timing my departure to coincide with the period when the infected seemed less active. I had observed that they were more aggressive during the night hours, perhaps drawn by the sounds that survivors made when they thought darkness provided cover. During the early morning, they appeared to be less responsive to stimuli, moving more slowly and with less apparent purpose. My destination was the hardware store 6 blocks away, a journey that would have taken me 10 minutes under normal circumstances but now required careful planning and constant vigilance. I loaded Roberto's tools into a canvas bag, along with basic supplies and the mining maps that showed the underground passages beneath the city. The maps were hand-drawn and decades old, but they represented my best hope for navigating the city safely if the surface became completely overrun. The street outside my workshop was littered with debris from the previous night's chaos. Broken glass, abandoned vehicles, and personal belongings scattered by people who had fled in panic created an obstacle course that I had to navigate silently. I could see dried blood on the pavement in several locations, dark stains that told stories of violence and desperation that I could only imagine. Moving from building to building, I used the construction knowledge that I had acquired over 20 years of working in urban environments. I knew which buildings had fire escapes, which alleys provided cover, and which rooftops could be accessed if I needed to get above the street level. The city that I had known as a place of business and routine had become a 3-dimensional puzzle that I had to solve in order to survive. The hardware store was partially destroyed, its front windows shattered and its contents scattered across the sidewalk. But the rear entrance was intact, and I was able to gain access to the areas where the more specialized tools were stored. I gathered pneumatic equipment, industrial cutting tools, and materials that could be used to reinforce defensive positions. Most importantly, I found industrial mining equipment that had been destined for construction projects in the mountains. The mining equipment was designed for breaking through rock and concrete, tools that could create passages through walls or clear debris from blocked tunnels. I had used similar equipment during my work on St. Augustine's Church, and I understood both its potential and its limitations. The tools were heavy and required compressed air to operate, but they represented capabilities that few other survivors would possess. As I loaded the equipment into a stolen shopping cart, I realized that my years of working with stone had given me advantages that extended beyond just defensive construction. I understood how buildings were put together, how weight was distributed through structural elements, and how to create or destroy passages through walls. These skills, combined with the industrial tools I was acquiring, would allow me to modify the urban environment to serve my survival needs. The return journey to my workshop was more dangerous than the outbound trip. The infected had become more active as the morning progressed, and I could hear them moving through the streets in what sounded like coordinated groups. They were not just wandering aimlessly, but appeared to be conducting systematic searches of the neighborhood, checking each building methodically for signs of survivors. I managed to reach my workshop without direct confrontation, but the experience reinforced my understanding that the infected were becoming more organized and persistent. They were learning, adapting their behavior based on their encounters with survivors. This was not the mindless horde that I had initially expected, but something more dangerous and unpredictable. Once back in my workshop, I began the process of upgrading my defenses using the materials I had acquired. I installed pneumatic tools that could be used as weapons, created backup power systems for my equipment, and established multiple escape routes in case my primary defenses were breached. The work was familiar and methodical, a way to channel my anxiety into productive activity. But even as I worked, I knew that my workshop was becoming a trap. The infected were conducting increasingly thorough searches of the neighborhood, and it was only a matter of time before they found a way to breach my defenses. I needed to relocate to a more defensible position, and the obvious choice was St. Augustine's Church, where I had spent 6 months reinforcing the walls and where I knew the underground passages could provide escape routes. The challenge was getting to the church, which was 8 blocks away through streets that were now patrolled by infected groups. I would need to move my essential supplies and equipment while avoiding detection, a task that would require multiple trips and careful timing. The alternative was to abandon most of my resources and make a single desperate run for the church, but that would leave me vulnerable and under-equipped for long-term survival. I decided to make the journey in stages, moving supplies to intermediate locations and establishing a network of cache points that I could use if my primary route was compromised. The first stage would be to reach the old courthouse, which was halfway to the church and connected to the underground tunnel system according to the mining maps. From there, I could access the tunnels and move beneath the city without being detected by the infected on the surface. The courthouse was a massive stone building that had been constructed in the same era as St. Augustine's Church, using similar techniques and materials. I had worked on restoration projects there several years earlier, and I knew that the building's basement levels extended deep underground, connecting to the network of mining tunnels that ran beneath the historic district. The building's thick walls and limited access points would make it defensible, and its connection to the tunnel system would provide escape routes if the situation deteriorated further. I made my first trip to the courthouse on the afternoon of the 5th day, carrying Roberto's tools and the most essential supplies. The journey required me to move through areas where the infected were actively patrolling, forcing me to take longer routes and spend extended periods hiding in abandoned buildings. The experience taught me valuable lessons about their behavior patterns and sensory capabilities. The infected seemed to rely primarily on hearing and smell to locate survivors, responding to sounds with remarkable precision, but having difficulty detecting stationary targets. They were also attracted to certain scents, particularly those associated with human habitation, cooking food, personal hygiene products, and the oils used to maintain mechanical equipment. This knowledge would prove crucial for avoiding detection during future supply runs. The courthouse basement was exactly as I remembered it from my restoration work, a maze of storage rooms and mechanical spaces that extended far below street level. But what I had not fully appreciated during my earlier visits was the extent of the tunnel connections. The mining map showed passages that led not only to St. Augustine's Church, but to several other buildings in the historic district, creating a network that would allow movement throughout the city center without surface exposure. I established my first cache point in a storage room that had been used for court records, a secure location that was unlikely to be discovered by casual searches. I hid Roberto's tools and backup supplies behind false walls that I constructed using techniques learned from years of working with stone and mortar. The cache was designed to be accessible only to someone who understood construction techniques, providing security without relying on locks or barriers that could be easily breached. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a steel door that appeared to be a utility closet, but actually provided access to the mining passages. The door was locked, but I was able to open it using tools that I had acquired during my hardware store expedition. Beyond the door was a concrete stairway that descended into darkness, leading to tunnels that had been carved through solid rock by miners who had worked the area more than a century earlier. The tunnels were in better condition than I had expected, with stone walls that showed minimal deterioration and wooden support beams that were still structurally sound. The passages were narrow, perhaps 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, but they were dry and relatively free of debris. Most importantly, they showed no signs of recent use, suggesting that few people knew about their existence or their potential value for moving unseen through the city. I spent several hours mapping the tunnel system, using the mining charts as a guide, but also documenting changes and obstacles that were not shown on the century-old drawings. The passages formed a complex network that connected multiple buildings, with branch tunnels that led to dead ends or collapsed sections. Understanding this system would be crucial for using it effectively, and I made detailed notes that would allow me to navigate the tunnels even in complete darkness. The main passage from the courthouse to St. Augustine's Church was approximately 1,200 feet long, following a route that paralleled the street above, but ran 30 feet underground. The tunnel was lined with cut stone blocks, evidence of the skilled craftsmanship that had been employed in its construction. There were also alcoves and side chambers that could be used for storage or as refuges if the main passage became compromised. I returned to my workshop as darkness fell, carrying information that would prove invaluable for the next phase of my survival strategy. The tunnel system was not just a means of transportation, but a parallel world beneath the city, where survivors could establish secure bases of operation. The passages were defensible, with narrow choke points that could be fortified against intruders, and they provided access to resources that were not available on the surface. The 6th day brought my first direct confrontation with the infected. I was making my second supply run to the courthouse when I encountered a group of 3 infected individuals who had apparently been tracking my movements. They were positioned along my planned route, not wandering randomly, but stationed as if they were expecting someone to pass through the area. The encounter taught me that the infected were capable of tactical thinking, able to anticipate survivor behavior and position themselves accordingly. They were not just reacting to immediate stimuli, but planning their actions based on observed patterns. This was a significant development that would require me to modify my approach to moving through the city. I managed to avoid direct confrontation by using alternate routes and by employing techniques that I had learned from working in construction zones where multiple hazards required constant awareness. The infected were persistent, but not particularly skilled at tracking targets that moved unpredictably and used cover effectively. However, their improved coordination suggested that they were learning from their encounters with survivors. The courthouse cache proved its value during this encounter, providing me with supplies and equipment that I would not have been able to carry during a hasty retreat. I was able to access Roberto's tools and use them to create barriers that blocked the infected from following me into the building. The tools were designed for precision work, but they were also effective for defensive purposes when used by someone who understood their capabilities. I spent the night in the courthouse, using the time to further explore the tunnel system and to establish additional cache points. The building's thick walls and limited access points made it an excellent defensive position, and its connection to the underground network provided escape routes that the infected could not follow. For the first time since the outbreak began, I felt that I had established a position that was both secure and sustainable. The 7th day brought the discovery that would change my understanding of the situation entirely. While exploring the deeper levels of the courthouse basement, I found evidence that other survivors had been using the building as a refuge. There were sleeping areas, food storage, and defensive preparations that showed clear signs of organized activity. More importantly, there were notes and maps that indicated a larger group of survivors was operating from St. Augustine's Church. The notes were written in multiple hands, suggesting a group of at least 6 or 7 people who had been coordinating their activities and sharing resources. They had been conducting supply runs, establishing cache points, and mapping the infected populations in different parts of the city. The information they had gathered was far more detailed than anything I had been able to compile on my own, and it painted a picture of a city where survival was possible but required cooperation and careful planning. According to the notes, the group at St. Augustine's Church included people with diverse skills, medical personnel, skilled trades workers, and individuals with military or law enforcement backgrounds. They had been working to establish a sustainable base of operations, using the church's reinforced walls and tunnel connections to create a secure haven for survivors. The structural work that I had completed during my renovation project had been crucial to their success. The discovery that other survivors were already established at my intended destination created both opportunities and complications. On one hand, joining an organized group would provide access to resources and capabilities that I could not develop on my own. On the other hand, integrating into an existing group would require negotiation and adaptation to their established procedures and leadership structure. I decided to make contact with the group at St. Augustine's Church, but I would do so carefully and on my own terms. I would approach them as an equal, offering my specialized skills and knowledge in exchange for membership in their community. The structural work I had completed on the church gave me valuable leverage in these negotiations, as did my understanding of the tunnel system and my access to specialized equipment. I spent the 8th day preparing for the journey to St. Augustine's Church, moving my remaining supplies through the tunnel system and establishing the final cache points that would support my transition from independent survival to group membership. The tunnels proved to be even more valuable than I had initially realized, allowing me to transport heavy equipment and supplies without detection by the infected, who were now patrolling the surface in organized groups. The journey to the church through the tunnels was challenging but successful. The passages were narrow and poorly lit, requiring careful navigation and constant attention to structural hazards. But they were also completely secure from the infected, who showed no awareness of the underground network and no ability to access the tunnels, even when they were directly overhead. I emerged from the tunnel system in the basement of St. Augustine's Church to find myself facing 3 armed survivors who had been expecting my arrival. They had been monitoring the tunnel entrances and had detected my approach through the underground passages. The confrontation was tense but brief, as they quickly recognized that I was not infected and that one possessed knowledge and skills that were valuable to their group. The leader of the group was Maria Santos, a registered nurse who had been working at Denver General Hospital when the outbreak began. She had managed to escape from the hospital with several other medical personnel and had made her way to St. Augustine's Church based on reports that it was a secure location. Her medical knowledge had made her invaluable to the group, and she had naturally assumed leadership responsibilities. The other survivors included Father Martinez, the priest who had originally commissioned my work on the church's structural reinforcements, Tom Bradley, a former police officer who had been coordinating the group's security measures, and Sarah Kim, an engineer who had been working on the city's infrastructure systems. There were also 3 other individuals whose skills complemented the group's capabilities: a teacher, a mechanic, and a retired military officer. Maria's first question concerned my knowledge of the church's structural modifications and my understanding of the tunnel system. She had been frustrated by the group's limited knowledge of the underground passages and their inability to fully utilize the defensive advantages that the building provided. My arrival represented an opportunity to unlock capabilities that the group had been unable to develop on their own. I provided detailed information about the structural reinforcements that I had installed, explaining how the walls had been modified to withstand significant impacts and how the building's defensive capabilities could be maximized. I also shared my maps of the tunnel system, showing the group how they could use the underground passages to conduct supply runs and to evacuate if the church was ever compromised. The group's reaction to my information was immediate and enthusiastic. They had been operating with limited knowledge of their defensive capabilities, and my expertise provided them with options that they had not previously considered. Father Martinez was particularly pleased to learn that his investment in structural reinforcements had been even more valuable than he had initially realized. In exchange for my knowledge and skills, the group offered me full membership in their community, including access to their resources and participation in their decision-making processes. They had established a democratic structure where major decisions were made by consensus, but they also recognized that individuals with specialized knowledge had greater authority in their areas of expertise. The integration process was surprisingly smooth, perhaps because the group had been anticipating the arrival of additional survivors and had developed procedures for evaluating and accepting new members. They conducted a thorough debriefing about my experiences and observations, gathering intelligence about infected behavior and survivor conditions in other parts of the city. My first contribution to the group's operations was to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the church's defensive capabilities and to recommend modifications that would improve their security. The structural work I had completed provided excellent protection against conventional threats, but it needed to be adapted for defense against the infected, who had different capabilities and behavior patterns than human attackers. I recommended the installation of additional barriers at key access points, the creation of multiple fallback positions within the building, and the establishment of early warning systems that would alert the group to approaching threats. I also suggested modifications to the tunnel entrances that would allow for rapid evacuation while preventing the infected from following the group into the FOVA's underground passages. The group's existing supplies were more extensive than I had expected, including medical equipment, weapons, and food stores that could sustain them for several weeks. They had been conducting regular supply runs using surface routes, but the increasing organization of the infected groups had made these operations more dangerous and less productive. My knowledge of the tunnel system would allow them to access resources that were not available through surface operations. Over the following days, I worked with the group to implement defensive improvements and to establish new supply routes through the tunnel system. The work was collaborative and efficient, with each member contributing their specialized knowledge to solve problems that none of us could have addressed individually. The combination of my construction skills, Maria's medical knowledge, Tom's security expertise, and Sarah's engineering background created capabilities that far exceeded what any of us could have achieved alone. The group's morale was remarkably high considering the circumstances. They had established routines and procedures that provided structure and purpose, and they had maintained their humanity through shared responsibilities and mutual support. The church setting contributed to their psychological well-being, providing a sense of sanctuary and continuity that was crucial for long-term survival. But even as we worked to improve our defenses and expand our capabilities, we were aware that our situation was temporary. The infected were becoming more organized and persistent, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered our location and tested our defenses. We needed to prepare for a prolonged siege, and we needed to develop contingency plans for evacuation if our position became untenable. The tunnel system would be crucial for both defense and evacuation, providing routes that the infected could not follow and access to resources that were not available on the surface. But the tunnels also presented challenges, including structural hazards, navigation difficulties, and the risk of becoming trapped underground if the surface entrances were compromised. I spent considerable time mapping the tunnel system and identifying potential hazards, working with Sarah to assess the structural integrity of the passages and to develop plans for maintaining and expanding the underground network. The tunnels were generally sound, but they showed signs of age and required regular maintenance to remain safe for regular use. The group's first major test came on the 15th day, when a large group of infected discovered our location and began probing our defenses. The attack was more coordinated than anything we had previously encountered, with the infected working together to test different access points and to maintain pressure on our defensive positions. The structural reinforcements that I had installed proved their value, holding against sustained attacks that would have breached conventional construction. The siege lasted for 3 days, during which we were forced to use every defensive capability that we had developed. The infected showed remarkable persistence, maintaining their attack even when it became clear that they were not making progress. They also demonstrated learning behavior, adapting their tactics based on our responses and attempting to exploit any weaknesses they discovered. Our defensive success was due primarily to the combination of structural reinforcements, strategic positioning, and coordinated teamwork. The thick stone walls channeled the infected into killing zones where we could engage them effectively, while the multiple fallback positions allowed us to maintain our defense even when individual positions were compromised. The tunnel system provided crucial logistical support, allowing us to move supplies and personnel without surface exposure. The siege ended when the infected apparently decided that our position was too well defended to justify continued attacks. They withdrew from the immediate area, but they maintained surveillance of our building, suggesting that they were planning future operations. The experience taught us that our defenses were effective but not impregnable, and that we needed to prepare for more sophisticated attacks in the future. The aftermath of the siege brought both confidence and concern. We had proven that our position was defensible, and that our group could work together effectively under extreme pressure. But we had also learned that the infected were capable of coordinated, sustained attacks that could eventually overwhelm even the best defenses. We needed to develop new capabilities and prepare for the possibility that our current position might become untenable. As we worked to repair damage from the siege and to improve our defenses based on lessons learned, we began to receive reports from other survivor groups through radio communications. The news was mixed, with some groups reporting successful defensive operations while others had been overrun or forced to evacuate. The overall picture was of a city where survival was possible, but required constant vigilance and adaptation. The reports also provided valuable intelligence about infected behavior and capabilities. The creatures were definitely learning and adapting, developing new tactics and showing increased coordination. But they also had limitations, including vulnerability to certain types of attacks and difficulty operating in environments that were specifically designed to counter their capabilities. Our group's success in defending St. Augustine's Church had established us as a significant survivor community, and we began to receive requests for assistance from other groups. Some wanted to join our community, while others sought information about defensive techniques and survival strategies. These interactions created opportunities for cooperation and resource sharing, but they also presented security risks and management challenges. As we approached the end of the first month of the outbreak, our group had evolved from a collection of individual survivors into a functioning community with established procedures, shared resources, and common goals. We had proven that long-term survival was possible, but we had also learned that success required constant effort and adaptation to changing circumstances. The tunnel system had become the foundation of our survival strategy, providing secure transportation routes, access to resources, and escape options that were not available to surface-based communities. My knowledge of the underground network had been crucial to our success, but it was the combination of all our skills and resources that had made our community viable. But as we celebrated our survival and planned for the future, we were also aware that our greatest challenges lay ahead. The infected were becoming more sophisticated and organized, and the resources available in our immediate area were beginning to be depleted. We would need to expand our operations and develop new capabilities if we were going to survive the long-term challenges of life in a world where the rules had fundamentally changed. The knowledge I had gained about underground construction and tunnel systems during my work on St. Augustine's Church had become the foundation of our survival strategy. But I was also learning that the skills required for long-term survival extended far beyond construction and engineering. We needed to develop capabilities in agriculture, manufacturing, communications, and dozens of other areas that would be necessary for rebuilding civilization. As I prepared for the next phase of our survival, I thought about Roberto's tools and the traditions they represented. 3 generations of stone carvers had passed down not just techniques for working with stone, but principles of craftsmanship, patience, and adaptation that were proving invaluable. In our current situation, the tools designed for carving memorials to the dead were now being used to build foundations for the living. The morning of day 46 brought sounds that we had been dreading for weeks. From our observation posts, in the church tower, we could see movement on the horizon that defied comprehension. What appeared to be thousands of infected individuals were moving toward our section of the city in a coordinated mass that stretched across multiple city blocks. This was not the scattered groups or small hunting parties that we had been dealing with. This was something entirely different, something that suggested the infected had developed organizational capabilities far beyond what we had previously encountered. Maria was the first to spot them through the binoculars that Tom had salvaged from an abandoned sporting goods store. She called us all to the tower, her voice carrying a tension that immediately put everyone on alert. As we took turns observing the approaching horde, the magnitude of our situation became clear. The infected were moving with purpose and coordination, following routes that would bring them directly to our neighborhood within hours. The horde was not just large, it was organized in ways that challenged our understanding of infected behavior. There were distinct groups within the mass, each following slightly different routes, but all converging on the same general area. Some groups were moving through the streets while others were traveling through buildings, suggesting a level of tactical planning that we had not previously witnessed. Most disturbing was the apparent communication between groups, with changes in direction that seemed to be coordinated across the entire formation. Father Martinez observed that the infected seemed to be following patterns that suggested they were being directed by some form of intelligence. Whether this was distributed decision-making among the infected themselves or coordination by infected individuals who had retained higher cognitive functions was unclear, but the implications were terrifying. We were no longer dealing with mindless predators, but with organized forces that could plan and execute complex operations. Tom immediately began coordinating our defensive preparations, but it was clear that our existing fortifications would not be sufficient against a force of this magnitude. The stone walls that had protected us against smaller attacks would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and our ammunition and supplies were not adequate for a prolonged siege against thousands of attackers. We needed to implement contingency plans that we had hoped would never be necessary. I gathered the group in the main sanctuary to discuss our options, using the mining maps to explain the evacuation routes that would be available if our defenses were breached. The tunnel system that had served us so well for supply runs and reconnaissance would now become our lifeline for survival. But evacuating through the tunnels with all our supplies and equipment would be a complex operation that required careful planning and precise execution. Sarah raised concerns about the structural integrity of the tunnel system under the stress of a major evacuation. The passages had been designed for mining operations, not for supporting large groups of people carrying heavy equipment. We would need to prioritize our most essential supplies and abandon anything that was not crucial for immediate survival. The decision was painful but necessary, as attempting to move too much equipment would slow our evacuation and potentially trap us in the tunnels if the infected discovered the entrances. The group's medical supplies were our first priority, as Maria's expertise would be useless without the tools and medications that she needed to treat injuries and illnesses. We had accumulated a substantial inventory of medical equipment during our supply runs, but much of it would have to be left behind. Maria worked with Tom to identify the most critical items, focusing on supplies that were lightweight, versatile, and difficult to replace. My tools presented a similar challenge. Roberto's hand tools were irreplaceable family heirlooms that represented 3 generations of craftsmanship knowledge, but the pneumatic equipment and industrial mining tools that had been so valuable for our construction projects were too heavy and bulky for tunnel evacuation. I made the difficult decision to prioritize the hand tools and the mining maps, while creating hidden caches for the larger equipment that we might be able to retrieve later. The approach of the horde also forced us to confront the reality that our group might be separated during the evacuation. The tunnel system had multiple branches and exit points, and if we were forced to evacuate under pressure, we might not be able to stay together as a single unit. We established rally points and communication protocols that would allow us to regroup if we became separated, but the prospect of losing group members was a constant source of anxiety. Father Martinez surprised us all by announcing that he would not be evacuating with the group. As the priest of St. Augustine's Church, he felt obligated to remain with the building and to provide sanctuary for any other survivors who might seek refuge there. His decision was courageous but also tragic, as we all knew that staying behind would likely mean death when the horde arrived. However, his choice to remain also provided us with valuable intelligence about the infected assault, as he would be able to observe their tactics and potentially communicate information to us through radio contact. The afternoon brought the first advance scouts of the approaching horde. Individual infected began appearing in our neighborhood, moving systematically from building to building in what appeared to be reconnaissance operations. These scouts were different from the infected we had previously encountered, showing greater caution and appearing to be gathering information rather than simply searching for immediate prey. Their behavior suggested that the main force was planning its assault based on intelligence about our defenses and capabilities. Tom positioned our best marksmen at concealed observation posts, with orders to avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. We needed to preserve our ammunition for the main assault, and engaging the scouts would reveal our defensive positions and capabilities. Instead, we observed their behavior and gathered intelligence about their tactics and coordination methods. The scouts spent several hours examining our building from multiple angles, testing our barriers and apparently communicating their findings to the main force through methods that we could not detect. They showed particular interest in the entrances to the tunnel system, suggesting that the infected had some awareness of the underground passages. This was deeply concerning, as our evacuation plans depended on the tunnels remaining secure and undetected. As evening approached, the scouts withdrew from our immediate area, but we could see the glow of fires and hear the sounds of destruction from other parts of the city. The main horde was systematically clearing buildings and eliminating any survivor groups that they encountered. The pattern of destruction suggested that they were working their way through the city in an organized manner, ensuring that no potential threats were left behind their advancing forces. I used the time before the main assault to conduct a final check of our tunnel entrances and to verify that our evacuation routes were clear and secure. The passages showed no signs of infected presence, but I discovered structural damage in one section that would limit our options if we needed to evacuate quickly. A partial collapse had reduced the clearance in the main passage to the courthouse, requiring us to modify our evacuation procedures and potentially split our group into smaller units. The discovery of tunnel damage forced me to reveal information that I had been keeping in reserve. During my exploration of the underground system, I had discovered connections to abandoned mining shafts that extended far beyond the historic district. These passages were older and less stable than the main tunnels, but they provided access to areas outside the city where the infected presence was unknown. The shafts represented our ultimate escape route if all other options were exhausted. Sarah was fascinated by the mining shaft connections, recognizing their potential value for long-term survival. The shafts led to an abandoned quarry complex 15 miles west of the city, a location that would provide natural defensive advantages and access to building materials. However, reaching the quarry would require a dangerous journey through unstable tunnels that might not support our entire group. The group debated whether to attempt evacuation to the quarry immediately or to try to defend our current position against the approaching horde. The quarry represented safety and long-term survival potential, but it also meant abandoning the resources and fortifications that we had worked so hard to establish. The decision was complicated by our uncertainty about conditions at the quarry and our limited knowledge of the route through the mining shafts. Maria argued for immediate evacuation, pointing out that our medical supplies were portable and that her skills would be more valuable in a location where we could establish a permanent community. Tom was reluctant to abandon our defensive preparations, but he acknowledged that our ammunition and weapons were insufficient for the approaching threat. The debate continued until the first sounds of the approaching horde made the decision for us. The infected arrived at our perimeter just after midnight, but their assault was unlike anything we had experienced during previous attacks. Instead of immediately testing our defenses, they surrounded the building and began what appeared to be systematic preparation for a coordinated assault. Groups of infected took positions at strategic points around the church, while others seemed to be examining our fortifications and planning their attack routes. The psychological pressure of being surrounded was intense. We could hear the infected moving around the building, their guttural communications creating a constant background noise that made rest impossible. They were clearly planning something more sophisticated than a simple frontal assault, and their patience suggested that they were confident in their ability to eventually breach our defenses. Tom organized our defensive positions, but our options were limited by the size of the attacking force. We had prepared for attacks by dozens of infected, not hundreds or thousands. Our ammunition would be exhausted quickly in a sustained firefight, and our defensive positions could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, regardless of how well we fought. The situation required us to think beyond conventional defense and to consider alternatives that we had hoped to avoid. The first probing attacks came at dawn, with small groups of infected testing our barriers at multiple points simultaneously. These attacks were coordinated and systematic, designed to identify weaknesses in our defenses rather than to achieve immediate breakthrough. The infected showed remarkable tactical discipline, withdrawing when they met effective resistance and shifting their efforts to different targets. During one of these probing attacks, I noticed that the infected were paying particular attention to areas near the tunnel entrances. They seemed to be aware that the building had underground connections, even though we had carefully concealed the access points. This suggested that their intelligence about our position was more detailed than we had realized, possibly gathered from survivors who had been captured or from infected individuals who retained memories from their human lives. The realization that our tunnel system might be compromised forced us to accelerate our evacuation preparations. We could not risk being trapped underground if the infected discovered and blocked our escape routes. I worked with Sarah to identify alternative passages that were less likely to be known to the infected, including some of the older mining shafts that connected to the quarry system. As the probing attacks continued throughout the morning, it became clear that the infected were gathering information for a major assault. They were learning our response patterns, identifying our weapons positions, and mapping our defensive capabilities. The main attack would come when they had gathered sufficient intelligence to ensure success, and we needed to evacuate before that happened. The decision to abandon St. Augustine's Church was one of the most difficult that our group had faced. The building represented security, community, and hope for the future. We had invested weeks of work in fortifying the structure and establishing our operations there. Leaving meant abandoning not just physical resources but also the psychological anchor that had sustained us through the worst days of the outbreak. Father Martinez's decision to remain behind added emotional weight to our departure. He had been instrumental in our group's formation and had provided moral guidance during our darkest moments. His choice to stay with his church was consistent with his character and beliefs, but it felt like we were abandoning a family member to certain death. The evacuation began in the late afternoon, with Tom and Maria leading the first group through the main tunnel while I remained behind to guide the remaining members through alternative passages. We had divided our supplies and equipment to ensure that the loss of any single group would not cripple our survival capabilities. The separation was intended to be temporary, but we all understood that circumstances might prevent us from reuniting. My group included Sarah and 2 other members who had engineering and technical skills that would be valuable for establishing operations at the quarry. We carried the mining maps, Roberto's tools, and specialized equipment that would be needed for construction and fortification projects. Our route through the older mining shafts was longer and more dangerous than the main tunnel, but it was also less likely to be discovered or blocked by the infected. The journey through the mining shafts was a test of endurance and nerve. The passages were narrow, poorly ventilated, and showed signs of structural instability. That made every step potentially dangerous. The walls were carved through solid rock, but decades of neglect had allowed water infiltration and freeze-thaw cycles to create cracks and weak points that could trigger collapses. As we moved through the shafts, I used my knowledge of stone and construction to assess the stability of each section and to identify the safest routes through areas of questionable integrity. The skills that I had learned for carving memorials and building foundations were now being applied to reading the structural language of underground passages, interpreting stress patterns and load distributions that determined whether sections of tunnel would support our passage. The mining equipment that I had salvaged during our early supply runs proved invaluable for clearing obstacles and stabilizing weak sections of the tunnel. The pneumatic tools could remove debris and shore up dangerous areas, while my understanding of stone cutting techniques allowed me to modify passages that were too narrow or unstable for safe transit. Several hours into our underground journey, we encountered evidence that other survivors had used these passages recently. There were tool marks on the walls, improvised supports in unstable sections, and cached supplies that had been hidden by people who understood the tunnel system. The discoveries were encouraging, suggesting that we were not alone in our efforts to escape the city through underground routes, but we also found evidence of tragedy in the tunnels. In one section, we discovered the remains of survivors who had apparently been trapped by a tunnel collapse while attempting to evacuate. Their equipment and personal belongings told stories of desperation and failed escape attempts that reminded us of the dangers we were facing. The discovery reinforced the importance of careful planning and structural assessment in underground operations. As we approached the section of tunnel that connected to the quarry system, we began to hear sounds from the surface that suggested the main assault on St. Augustine's Church had begun. The rumble of collapsing masonry and the sounds of sustained combat filtered down through the rock, providing a grim soundtrack to our evacuation. Father Martinez's radio transmissions had stopped several hours earlier, suggesting that our defensive positions had been overrun. The final section of our journey led through passages that showed clear signs of recent mining activity. The walls were fresh-cut stone, and there were modern supports and ventilation systems that had not appeared on our historical maps. Someone had been extending and improving the tunnel system, creating connections that enhanced the underground network's utility for transportation and refuge. We emerged from the tunnel system at an abandoned mining facility on the outskirts of the quarry complex. The surface installation was in ruins, but the underground connections were intact and well maintained. More importantly, there were clear signs that other survivors were using the facility as a base of operations. Fresh tool marks, recent construction projects, and maintained equipment suggested an active community that had been working to establish a permanent settlement. The quarry itself was a massive excavation that had been carved into a hillside, creating natural stone walls that rose hundreds of feet above the floor of the pit. The scale of the operation was impressive, with multiple levels of cuts and terraces that provided both defensive advantages and building sites for a permanent community. The geography of the location would make it nearly impossible for infected forces to assault successfully, while the abundance of building materials would support long-term construction projects. As we explored the quarry complex, we discovered that Tom and Maria's group had arrived safely and had already begun establishing defensive positions and supply caches. The reunion was emotional and relieving, confirming that our evacuation plans had been successful despite the challenges we had faced. But the celebration was tempered by our awareness that we were now refugees from our former home, starting over in an unknown location with limited resources. The quarry community that we discovered was larger and more sophisticated than we had expected. There were survivors who had been living there for weeks, using the natural defenses and abundant building materials to create a settlement that was both secure and sustainable. Their experience and established infrastructure would be valuable for our integration, but it also meant that we were joining an existing community rather than founding our own. The settlement's leader was Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a geology professor who had recognized the quarry's potential early in the outbreak and had been working to attract skilled survivors to help build a permanent community. Her scientific background and practical experience with mining operations made her uniquely qualified to manage the complex challenges of establishing civilization in a post-apocalyptic environment. Dr. Hayes was particularly interested in my construction and stoneworking skills, recognizing their value for the ambitious building projects that she had planned for the quarry settlement. The community needed permanent structures for housing, workshops, and food storage, all of which would require the kind of specialized knowledge that I could provide. My experience with underground construction would also be valuable for expanding the tunnel connections and creating secure storage areas. The integration process was smoother than I had expected, perhaps because the quarry community had been actively recruiting survivors with useful skills. They had established procedures for evaluating new arrivals and for assigning roles based on individual capabilities and community needs. The democratic principles that had governed our group at St. Augustine's Church were compatible with the quarry settlement's organizational structure. As I began to understand the scope of the community's plans and the resources available for their implementation, I realized that we had not just escaped from the infected horde, but had discovered an opportunity to participate in rebuilding civilization on a scale that would not have been possible at our previous location. The quarry provided everything necessary for long-term survival and growth, while the community's diverse skills and shared commitment offered hope for creating something better than what we had lost. The deeper we ventured into the mining tunnel system, the more I understood that our escape from St. Augustine's Church was only the beginning of a far more complex journey. The passages that Dr. Hayes had shown us on her geological surveys extended much further than any of us had realized, creating an underground network that connected not just to the quarry, but to mining operations throughout the entire mountain region. What we had thought was a simple evacuation route was actually part of a vast subterranean world that few people on the surface had ever known existed. The tunnel we were following had been carved through solid granite using techniques that combined traditional mining methods with modern engineering. The walls showed tool marks from multiple eras of excavation, with some sections dating back to the original silver mining boom of the 1800s and others showing evidence of more recent industrial operations. The variety of construction methods created a complex environment where structural integrity varied dramatically from section to section. Maria's medical training proved invaluable as we navigated the underground passages. The confined spaces and poor air quality created respiratory challenges for several group members, and the physical demands of carrying equipment through narrow tunnels were causing injuries that required immediate attention. She had managed to salvage a portable medical kit during our evacuation, and her ability to treat problems as they developed was crucial for maintaining our group's mobility and morale. The psychological pressure of underground travel was more intense than I had anticipated. The constant darkness, the oppressive weight of rock overhead, and the knowledge that we were completely cut off from the surface world created anxiety that affected everyone differently. Some group members thrived in the enclosed environment, finding security in the solid barriers that protected us from infected threats. Others struggled with claustrophobia and disorientation that made even simple tasks challenging. Sarah's engineering background became essential as we encountered sections of tunnel that showed signs of structural instability. Her ability to read stress patterns in the rock and to identify potential collapse zones allowed us to navigate safely through areas that would have been impassable for less experienced travelers. She also understood the ventilation systems that had been installed in the more recent tunnel sections, ensuring that we maintained access to breathable air during our extended underground journey. The tunnel system revealed evidence of recent activity that suggested we were not the only survivors who had discovered the underground network. There were tool caches, improvised shelters, and communication equipment that indicated other groups had been using the passages for transportation and refuge. Some of the installations appeared to be quite sophisticated, suggesting that organized communities were operating throughout the underground system. We encountered our first evidence of infected presence in the tunnels when we discovered claw marks and blood stains in a section that connected to a building basement in the city. The marks were fresh, indicating that infected individuals had recently attempted to access the tunnel system. The discovery was alarming because it suggested that our underground refuge was not as secure as we had believed, and that the infected were learning to exploit the same passages that survivors were using for protection. The infected presence in the tunnels created new tactical challenges that we had not previously considered. The narrow passages that provided security against surface threats also limited our options for combat and escape if we encountered infected groups underground. Our weapons and fighting techniques had been developed for surface operations, and they would be less effective in the confined spaces of the tunnel system. I began to modify our travel procedures based on my understanding of underground construction and the tactical requirements of tunnel operations. We established communication protocols that would allow us to coordinate our movements without alerting infected groups to our presence. We also identified fallback positions and alternative routes that would provide escape options if our primary passage was compromised. The discovery of an active underground community came when we reached a major junction where multiple tunnel systems converged. The area had been developed into a way station with sleeping quarters, supply storage, and communication equipment that connected to other locations throughout the underground network. The facility was staffed by survivors who had been coordinating traffic through the tunnel system and providing assistance to groups like ours who were attempting to reach the quarry settlement. The way station coordinator was Marcus Webb, a former mine supervisor who had recognized the potential of the tunnel system early in the outbreak and had been working to organize its use by survivor communities. His knowledge of mining operations and underground construction was extensive, and he had been instrumental in maintaining and improving the passages that connected different safe zones throughout the region. Marcus provided us with updated intelligence about conditions in the tunnel system and about the infected presence that we might encounter during the remainder of our journey. According to his reports, several sections of the network had been compromised by infected groups who had learned to navigate the underground passages. These areas required detours and special precautions that would extend our travel time, but increase our chances of reaching the quarry safely. The intelligence about infected tunnel operations was disturbing because it indicated that the creatures were adapting to underground environments and developing new hunting strategies. They were not just randomly entering the tunnels, but were conducting systematic exploration that suggested planning and coordination. The implications for long-term tunnel security were serious, as traditional defensive measures would need to be modified for underground operations. Marcus also provided information about the quarry settlement that helped us understand what we would encounter when we arrived. The community had grown significantly since Dr. Hayes had established it, with over 60 survivors who had contributed diverse skills and resources to building a sustainable operation. The settlement had established manufacturing capabilities, agricultural systems, and defensive measures that made it one of the most successful survivor communities in the region. The final phase of our tunnel journey required passage through the most challenging section of the underground network. The route to the quarry led through abandoned mining shafts that had been partially flooded and showed significant structural deterioration. The passages were barely wide enough for single-file travel, and the footing was treacherous due to loose rock and standing water that concealed obstacles and hazards. Roberto's tools proved their value once again as we navigated the deteriorated passages. The hand-forged chisels and cutting implements were perfect for clearing obstacles and improving handholds in sections where the tunnel walls had become unstable. The tools had been designed for precision work on finished stone, but their quality construction and versatile design made them effective for emergency modifications to raw rock surfaces. The flooded sections of the tunnel system presented unique challenges that required creative solutions. Sarah's engineering knowledge was crucial for assessing water levels and determining whether passages were safe for transit. In some areas, we had to construct temporary bridges using salvaged materials and construction techniques that I had learned during my work on building foundations and structural supports. As we approached the quarry complex, we began to encounter defensive measures that had been installed by the settlement community. There were concealed observation posts, communication systems, and barriers that could be activated to block tunnel access if the underground network was compromised by hostile forces. The sophistication of these installations indicated that the quarry settlement had developed serious defensive capabilities and was prepared for threats from both surface and underground sources. The emergence from the tunnel system into the quarry complex was both relief and revelation. After days of travel through confined underground passages, the open space of the quarry pit felt vast and liberating. But the scale of the excavation was also intimidating, with stone walls that rose hundreds of feet above the floor and terraced levels that created a complex three-dimensional environment unlike anything we had previously experienced. The quarry settlement had been established on multiple levels of the excavation, with different areas designated for specific functions. The upper terraces were used for housing and community facilities, while the lower levels contained workshops, storage areas, and industrial operations. The natural stone walls provided excellent defensive positions, while the abundance of building materials supported continuous construction and improvement projects. Dr. Hayes welcomed our group personally, conducting a detailed briefing about the settlement's operations and the role that our skills would play in the community's development. The quarry had been selected not just for its defensive advantages, but for its potential as a long-term base for rebuilding civilization. The site provided access to building materials, water sources, and transportation routes that would support a growing population and expanding operations. The integration process included assignments based on individual skills and community needs. My construction and stoneworking background made me valuable for the settlement's ambitious building projects, which included permanent housing, workshops, and defensive installations. The community had plans for expanding beyond the quarry itself, establishing outposts and satellite facilities that would create a network of secure locations throughout the region. Maria's medical expertise was immediately put to use treating injuries and illnesses that had accumulated among the settlement population. The community had basic medical facilities, but they lacked the specialized knowledge and experience that she brought from her hospital background. Her arrival represented a significant improvement in the settlement's healthcare capabilities and survival prospects. Tom's security experience was essential for the settlement's defensive planning and operations. The community had established basic security measures, but they needed someone with his tactical knowledge to coordinate their defenses and train other residents in combat techniques. The threat of infected attacks remained constant, and the settlement's survival depended on maintaining effective defensive capabilities. The quarry's workshop facilities provided opportunities to fully utilize Roberto's tools for the first time since leaving my original workshop in Denver. The settlement had established metalworking and stone-cutting operations that could benefit from traditional craftsmanship techniques, while my knowledge of construction methods would be valuable for the community's building projects. The combination of traditional skills and modern equipment created capabilities that neither approach could achieve alone. The settlement's agricultural operations were more advanced than I had expected, with terraced growing areas that took advantage of the quarry's unique geography and water management systems that collected and distributed rainfall throughout the complex. The community had been working to achieve food security through diverse growing methods that would support a larger population as the settlement continued to expand. The discovery of the settlement's communication network revealed connections to other survivor communities throughout the region. The quarry was not an isolated refuge, but part of a developing network of safe zones that were coordinating their activities and sharing resources. The scope of the survival network was encouraging, suggesting that civilization was beginning to rebuild in organized fashion rather than through scattered individual efforts. The settlement's leadership structure was democratic but practical, with Dr. Hayes serving as coordinator, while specific operations were managed by individuals with relevant expertise. The system allowed for efficient decision-making while ensuring that community members had input into policies that affected their lives. The approach was similar to what we had developed at St. Augustine's Church, but it was more formalized and better suited to managing a larger population. As I began to understand the full scope of the quarry settlement's operations and potential, I realized that we had not just found refuge, but had discovered an opportunity to participate in rebuilding society on a scale that none of us had imagined possible. The combination of natural advantages, accumulated resources, and diverse skills created the foundation for something that could grow beyond mere survival into genuine reconstruction of civilization. The settlement's plans for expansion included establishing satellite communities, developing trade relationships with other survivor groups, and creating educational systems that would preserve knowledge and skills for future generations. The quarry would serve as the anchor for a regional network of communities that could support each other and coordinate their efforts to reclaim territory from the infected populations. My role in these expansion plans would focus on construction and fortification projects that would secure new territory and establish permanent facilities for growing communities. The skills that I had developed from memorial carving and building construction would be applied to creating the physical infrastructure that would support thousands of survivors and their descendants. The tools that Roberto had passed down through 3 generations would be used to build foundations for a new civilization. The psychological impact of joining a thriving community after weeks of desperate survival was profound. The settlement provided not just physical security, but hope for the future and purpose beyond mere day-to-day survival. The opportunity to contribute to something larger than individual or small group survival gave meaning to the struggles we had endured and the losses we had suffered. But even as we celebrated our arrival at the quarry settlement and began to plan our contributions to its growth, we remained aware that our survival was still precarious and that the infected threat had not been eliminated. The settlement's defenses were strong, but they had not been tested against the kind of organized assault that had destroyed our position at St. Augustine's Church. The continuing development of infected capabilities meant that no position was permanently secure, and that survival would require constant vigilance and adaptation. The quarry settlement represented hope and opportunity, but it also represented responsibility for maintaining and expanding what had been built through the sacrifices and efforts of many survivors. The community's success would depend on our ability to work together effectively, to continue developing new capabilities, and to remain prepared for challenges that we had not yet imagined. The next phase of our survival would be about building rather than just defending, about creating rather than just preserving, about establishing something permanent in a world where everything seemed temporary and fragile. The quarry settlement had given us hope, but hope came with the responsibility of making it permanent. Dr. Hayes had ambitious plans that extended far beyond the stone walls of our refuge, and my role in those plans became clear within days of our arrival. The settlement needed to expand, not just to accommodate more survivors, but to establish a sustainable foundation for rebuilding civilization. The skills that Roberto had passed down through 3 generations of stone carvers would now be used to create something that could last for centuries. My first major project was establishing permanent workshops within the quarry complex. The settlement had basic facilities, but they lacked the specialized equipment and layout needed for large-scale construction projects. Using my knowledge of workshop design and the abundance of quarried stone available on site, I began creating spaces that could support everything from precision toolmaking to massive architectural projects. The workshops would serve as the foundation for all other construction activities in the settlement. The workshop construction required techniques that combined traditional stone cutting methods with modern engineering principles. Sarah worked with me to design ventilation systems and power distribution networks that would support both hand tools and mechanized equipment. The project gave us an opportunity to train other settlement members in construction techniques, creating a skilled workforce that could take on increasingly complex building projects. As we worked on the workshops, I began training apprentices in the traditional techniques that Roberto had taught me. The settlement had several young people who were eager to learn practical skills, and stone carving represented both an art form and a crucial construction capability. Teaching the traditional methods ensured that the knowledge would survive even if something happened to me, while also creating a connection to the craftsmanship traditions that had sustained my family through difficult times. The apprenticeship program became more important than just skill transfer when we discovered that the settlement's expansion plans would require capabilities that none of us currently possessed. Dr. Hayes wanted to establish satellite communities at strategic locations throughout the region, each of which would need permanent fortifications and infrastructure. The scale of construction required would demand a workforce of skilled craftspeople who understood both traditional techniques and modern construction methods. Roberto's tools took on new significance as teaching instruments. Each chisel and cutting implement represented not just a functional tool, but a connection to techniques and principles that had been refined over generations. The apprentices learned not just how to cut stone, but how to read the material, how to work with its natural properties, and how to create structures that would remain stable for decades or centuries. The memorial project began when Dr. Hayes asked me to create a permanent marker, honoring the survivors who had died during the outbreak and the journey to the quarry. The request brought my work full circle, returning to the memorial carving. That had been my specialty before the outbreak while serving the needs of our new community. But this memorial would be different from the individual headstones I had carved in my Denver workshop. This would be a monument to collective loss and collective survival. The memorial design required input from the entire settlement community. Every survivor had lost family members, friends, and colleagues during the outbreak, and the monument needed to represent all of those losses while also celebrating the community's survival and future prospects. The design process became a form of group therapy, allowing people to share their grief while also committing to building something positive from their experiences. I chose to carve the memorial from a single massive block of granite that had been quarried from the settlement's own walls. The stone itself represented the community's foundation, while the carving would transform raw material into something that honored both the dead and the living. The work required months of careful planning and execution, but it also provided a focus for the community's emotional healing and collective identity formation. The memorial project attracted attention from other survivor communities in the region. Word of the quarry settlement's success had spread through radio networks and traveler reports, and other groups began requesting assistance with their own construction and fortification projects. These requests created opportunities for trade and cooperation, but they also revealed the scope of the challenges facing all survivor communities. The trade relationships that developed from our construction expertise provided access to resources and capabilities that the quarry settlement could not produce independently. Other communities had developed agricultural systems, manufacturing operations, and specialized services that complemented our construction and defense capabilities. The growing network of trade relationships suggested that regional reconstruction was becoming possible through coordinated efforts. Dr. Hayes proposed establishing a formal alliance between survivor communities that would coordinate defensive efforts, share resources, and plan joint projects that no single community could accomplish alone. The alliance would require permanent communication systems, transportation networks, and standardized construction techniques that would allow communities to support each other effectively. My role in the alliance would be to establish construction standards and training programs that could be implemented across multiple communities. The alliance discussions revealed that the infected threat was evolving in ways that required coordinated responses. Reports from other communities indicated that infected groups were becoming larger and more organized, with some areas experiencing coordinated attacks by thousands of infected individuals. The defensive measures that had been adequate for protecting individual communities would not be sufficient against these larger threats. The quarry settlement's defensive advantages had protected us from major infected attacks, but we knew that our security was temporary. The steep stone walls and limited access points that made the quarry defensible also made it vulnerable to siege tactics. If infected groups developed the coordination and persistence to maintain prolonged attacks, we needed to prepare for threats that we had not yet encountered while also maintaining our expansion and development plans. The construction of satellite communities became urgent as reports of infected evolution continued to reach us. The satellite settlements would serve as early warning systems, resource production centers, and fallback positions if the main quarry settlement was ever threatened. Each satellite would need to be defensible independently while also contributing to the overall security and sustainability of the regional network. I led the site selection and initial construction for the first satellite settlement, choosing a location that provided natural defensive advantages while also offering access to resources that the quarry settlement needed. The site was an abandoned mining town with existing infrastructure that could be modified and expanded using our construction techniques. The project would test our ability to establish secure communities in hostile territory while maintaining connection to our main base. The satellite construction project required everything I had learned about defensive architecture, resource management, and community planning. The settlement needed to be large enough to support a viable population, but small enough to be defensible with limited resources. The construction techniques needed to be efficient and practical while also creating structures that would last for generations. The work on the satellite settlement attracted new survivors who had heard about our success and wanted to join our community. Each new arrival brought skills and knowledge that enhanced our capabilities, but they also created challenges for resource allocation and community integration. The growth was encouraging, but it also forced us to develop systems for managing larger populations and more complex operations. As the satellite settlement neared completion, we received reports of massive infected movements in distant parts of the region. The reports suggested that infected populations were consolidating into enormous hordes that could overwhelm any fixed defensive position through sheer numbers. The intelligence forced us to reconsider our defensive strategies and to prepare for threats on a scale that we had not previously imagined. The completion of the memorial coincided with the first major test of our regional alliance. A large survivor community 50 miles south of our location was under siege by an infected horde that numbered in the tens of thousands. The community's defensive measures were failing, and they had requested assistance from all allied settlements. The response would determine whether our alliance was capable of coordinating effective mutual defense, or whether each community would ultimately face the infected threat alone. Dr. Hayes called for volunteers to join a relief expedition that would attempt to break the siege and evacuate survivors from the threatened community. The mission would be dangerous and would require our best people and equipment, but it would also demonstrate our commitment to the alliance and our capability to project force beyond our own territory. I volunteered for the mission, bringing Roberto's tools and my construction expertise to what might become a rescue operation or a recovery mission. The relief expedition represented everything that our community had worked to achieve: the capability to help others, the resources to undertake dangerous missions, and the commitment to building something larger than individual survival. The mission would test our training, our equipment, and our resolve in ways that defensive operations had not. Success would prove that we had truly begun to rebuild civilization, while failure would demonstrate that we were still vulnerable survivors struggling against overwhelming odds. As I prepared Roberto's tools for what might be their most important mission, I thought about the journey that had brought us from individual survival to community building to regional cooperation. The skills that had been developed for carving names in stone to remember the dead were now being used to build foundations for the living and to create networks that could support thousands of survivors and their descendants. The story of our survival was not ending with the establishment of the quarry settlement, or even with the creation of the regional alliance. It was evolving into something larger and more complex, a story of rebuilding and growth that would continue for generations. The tools and traditions that Roberto had passed down would be part of that continuing story, contributing to the foundation of whatever civilization emerged from the chaos of the outbreak. The memorial that I had carved stood as a promise to both the dead and the living. We would remember those we had lost, but we would not be defined by our losses. We would build something permanent and valuable from the temporary and fragile circumstances of our survival. The stone would endure, the community would grow, and the future would be shaped by our choices and our commitment to something better than what we had lost. I thought my job was preserving the past through stone. Turns out, it was preparing me to build the future.